Hi everyone, sorry I can't be there in class today. What we're going to do is finish up the final commentaries on Perek, the chapter that we've been studying in class in the last few classes. So we're going to start here in Pasuk Vav, which we covered in class. Vayitzav Paraoh bayom hahu et hanoksim ba'am v'shotrav lemor. This was the command that Paraoh gave to the taskmasters and the shotrim to carry out this new policy of not giving the people the materials to build the bricks with, but still requiring them to fulfill the quota, the same quota of bricks that they had been making in the past. So the work got harder. So Rashi points out on this Pasuk that there seems to be two different groups of people who were in charge of the work. You have the Nogsim and the Shotrav and the Nogsim. So Rashi points out here in Pasuk Vav, this is on your sheet, question number 3 Aleph. Okay, Rashi Dibra Machil HaNogsim. And he says, very simply, Mitzriim Hayu. The Nogsim, in English taskmasters, were the Egyptians, and the Shotrim, who are the second group mentioned of people in charge of slavery, are mentioned here, were the Jewish taskmasters, the Jews who were in charge of the other Jews that were enslaved. So the way it worked, explains Rashi, Hanoges Mimune al Kama Shotrim. The Egyptian taskmaster would be in charge of a number of Jewish officers. So let's say every Egyptian, just for example, every Egyptian taskmaster would have under him 10 Jewish officers. And the Jewish officer was in charge of basically beating and hitting the Jews who were not carrying out their jobs, or to make sure that they finished their work. So basically they were all slaves. It's just that some Jews were given the ability to have a higher status of being a shoter, an officer, but at the end of the day, they have to answer to the Nogsim, as we see later in the Perek. And this was the second Rashi that I put on that question. In Pasuk Yudalad, it says, "Vayuku shotrei b'nei Yisrael asher samu alehem nogsei Paraoh lemor madua lo chilitem chochem lilbon kimo shilshom gam t'mol gam hayom." And the shotrim of Bnei Israel were beating. These people were put there by the Nogsim. So Rashi here is dealing with the language of the Pasuk, the word Vayuku. And he says we should read this as not the Shotrei Bnei Israel were hitting, but rather they themselves were being beaten up. They were being beaten up because they weren't doing their job. Their job was to make sure the Jewish slaves were making the amount of bricks that Paraoh wanted, even though they didn't have the material. And apparently, they were getting beaten by their own bosses, who were the Egyptian Nogsim, the Egyptian taskmasters. And the problem was that they weren't fulfilling the quota of bricks. So Rashi points out here, Vayuku, in Pasuk Yudalad, over here, Vayuku Hashotrim Yisraelim Hayu, meaning the people that were getting beaten were the officers themselves. Who was beating them? The Egyptian officers were beating up the Jewish officers, because it's all going all the way back to Paraoh. So the Egyptian officers, taskmasters, were ultimately responsible to come to Paraoh and say, here are all the bricks. The way that they were to get the bricks is they told the people that were under them, the Jewish officers, and the Jewish officers were going to go and make sure the Jews fulfilled their quota of bricks. And obviously this new situation where Paraoh put in a new policy of bringing the same amount of bricks, but without the materials to build it with, it was basically impossible. So at some point, these Jewish officers are going to feel very bad. How could we just beat the Jews nonstop? It's a terrible thing. These are our brothers. So they decided, we're not going to beat up the Jews, we're going to take the brunt, we're going to take the hit from the Egyptian taskmasters on behalf of the Jewish people. And he says, they decided not to carry out the beating of the Jews to make sure that they would fulfill their brick quota. And and when they would finish the bricks and bring them over to the Egyptian taskmasters, and they would count them up, and they would say, hold on, you were supposed to bring us 1,000 bricks and you only brought us 900, hayu malchinotam. Then the Egyptian taskmasters would start beating the Jewish officers because they weren't doing enough to get the Jewish slaves to get their work done. Lefikach, says Rashi, zachu otam shotrim liyot sanhedrin. We see what happened as a reward for these Jewish officers who refused to senselessly beat their Jewish slaves who were working under them. They were rewarded with becoming the great Sanhedrin, the great Jewish court of sages of the Jewish people. This happened later in the book of Bamidbar, and they were given prophecy. The Netzal min ruach asher al Moshe, as the Torah teaches us in the book of Bamidbar, chapter 11, Perek Yud Aleph. Vehusam alehem, they were given positions of leadership. They were given prophecy. Shenemar esfali shivim ish miziknei Yisrael asher yadata. It was at that time that the Jewish people were asking for help. They were asking for meat, and Moshe comes to God and he says, I need help. I can't do this all on my own. So God says, okay, go gather 70 elders that you know of. You know about them. Very vague, very ambiguous. Who are the 70 elders that Moshe knows? Who are they that he knows about them already? People from his past. Says Rashi, Me'otan shi'adata tovasha suv Mitzrayim. Moshe, you remember those 70 people who were in Mitzrayim, and instead of beating up the Jews to make more bricks, which was impossible for them, they decided to take the beatings themselves. And as a reward, they were given the eventual reward of being great leaders of the Jewish people, part of the Sanhedrin, the great court of the Jewish people. So we see amazing act of heroism here on behalf of the Jewish officers who simply could have just said, "It's our job. We're going to beat the Jews. They're brothers, but we need to make sure to keep our own jobs. We need to make sure we don't get in harm's way. So if it means that we have to hurt the Jews so that they'll make the bricks, okay, but as long as we're protected." They said no. This is a time of unity. This is a time where we have to protect our brothers. This is a time where we have to help out and do anything we can. And Paraoh is being very evil and very cruel to the people. And we're going to stand up for what's unjust. We're going to stand up for what we see as immoral and not appropriate policy that Paraoh is putting in place. And they, Vayuku, so look back in the Pasuk here, Vayuku Shotri, so they took the beatings. The Shotrim of Bnei Yisrael took the beatings instead of the slaves themselves. This act of heroism is obviously a crucial message in our responsibility to our fellow Jews, and making sure that we do all we can to protect them and to keep them out of harm's way when possible. There's two other interesting points in this whole episode where Paraoh makes the work harder for them. One of them is a Midrash, which I put here on the page, 3bet. And the Midrash says, at the end of the story, when, where is it here? Where is that? Oh, here, Pasuk Yud. When they went out to the people to tell them the new policy. So the Midrash says like this: Kevan Gazar came. The minute Paraoh put this new policy in place, Halach Moshe leMidyan. Moshe actually returned to Midyan. V'asa shisha chodashim. And he went back, and he literally left Egypt, and he said, I'm done. I didn't sign up for this. I came to Paraoh to let the Jews leave for a few days to have a break, to go have a chag with their God in the desert. And he said no, not only no, but making the work even harder. Moshe said, he screams at God and he says, this isn't what I signed up for. I'm not interested in this kind of job. The Aaron Aaron stayed in Mitzrayim. And it was at this time that Moshe actually brought his entire family back to Midian. Now this Midrash is interesting. Whether we read this literally or not is an interesting question. Did Moshe actually go back to Midian, or did he not go back to Midian? But this is just coming to emphasize how angry he was. I think it's coming to highlight this point. And when we read this story, you can imagine Moshe fought with God at length. I don't want to do it. I don't want to take on the job. He's not going to listen to me. The people aren't going to listen to me. Finally, he agrees. And God says, you're going to show him signs and everything's going to be okay. And I'll be with you and Aaron will speak for you. And we get the whole story. And then all of a sudden, Moshe walks in and he's confident and he feels that he's going to be able to get through to Paraoh. And he doesn't end up working. And it ends up not only going back in his face, but making the Jewish people in a worse situation. And Moshe feels really bad. He feels, I did this. But he doesn't want to take the blame. He goes back to God at the end of the Perek and he says, right? He says here at the end of the Perek in Pasuk Chavbet, Vayashem Moshe Hashem, what's going on? What'd you do? What'd you do? This isn't what I signed up for. So this Midrash is interesting because it's highlighting the anger that Moshe had with God over the fact that a mission that was supposed to be successful ended up being a big failure. One interesting point on this is that at the beginning of the 6th Perek, which we're going to start next week, at the beginning of the 6th Perek, God's response to Moshe is, "Vayomer Hashem Moshe, Tatira Asher Asela Paraoh, ki bi'achazaka yishalchem, bi'achazaka yigarshem yirtzah." You're going to see what I'm going to do to Paraoh. It's interesting that God doesn't criticize Moshe for rebuking God and screaming at God, how could you do this? Why did you send me? His answer to Moshe is, don't worry, I'm going to get Paraoh back. Which is interesting because it's not really what I would have thought God's response would have been. So part of the answer is that God was hoping, he didn't do this to get Moshe riled up, but the fact that Moshe responded with compassion, with feeling, with emotion, God was very excited about this. Because since Moshe had left Egypt, we hadn't seen him really so excited about wanting to go and save the people. All of a sudden, he's interested. Okay, we're going to skip 3 Gimel. You can cross that one out. And we're just going to go to the last piece on this Perek, which is Pasuk Chaf. The Pasuk teaches us, Vayikach Amram et Yocheved Dodato. Sorry, that's Perek Vav. Let's go back to Perek Hey, Pasuk Chaf. And it says here, Vayifku Moshe v'Aaron nitzavim mikrotam b'tzeitam Epro. So we mentioned that there was a people that met Moshe and Aaron as they were leaving the palace of Paraoh, and they confronted them and they said, what are you doing? What did you do? You crazy? You made the work harder. You made everything worse. All you did since you came here is just mess everything up. So who were these people? Vayifku Moshe v'Aaron. Who were they? It doesn't say who they were. It just says they met them. Vayifkeu doesn't tell us anything about who these people were. So obviously we know Rashi likes to tell us the identity of people who the text doesn't share with us. And he says here in Pasuk Chaf, Anashim Yisrael and Moshe v'Aaron v'Rabatinu Jarshu. Who were they? Of course, the notorious Datan and Aviram, who we've already met back in the story where Moshe had those 2 Jews who were fighting with each other back and forth. Shenemar Bahem Yatsu Nitzavim. Kol Nitzim v'Nitzavim, says Rashi. Every time the Torah says that they were standing up tall, as it says here in this Pasuk, right? Nitzavim Likortam, they were standing there waiting for Moshe and Aaron to scream at them. That's referring to Datan and Aviram. Where is the other episode of this? So later in the book of Bamidbar, where there's an incident with this guy Korach who wants to take out Moshe from his job, Datan and Aviram are basically involved in this whole riot. And over there, we have this language that they stood nitzavim, the same word that was used here in Pasuk K, that they were standing there, the same word nitzavim. And nitzavim, Rashi gets the notion that it was these 2 guys who were constantly causing trouble, constantly standing up to Moshe.